Thank you very much, Professor Yu. This is a great opportunity to come down here and speak at one of the great academic institutions in the U.S. I've been coming here since 2001, and I really love it. It's a wonderful opportunity. I'll try to make this as interesting as the pizza that was temporarily here a few minutes ago. Of course, I think in this environment I don't need to say that these are my own views, but just in case, there it is. I should also say there are many things that we can talk about regarding China, and I'm sure if you take Professor Yu's class or Professor Yongdeng's class, you'll see what a complex and important topic it is, including the fact that these days we're having more and more developments in our military-to-military relations with China. We have tremendous shared economic interests, but that's not what I'm going to talk about today, although we could have a whole other series of lectures on that. What I want to raise with you today are some areas of uncertainty and concern with regard to China's military development that I don't think we need to get overly alarmist about, but I think we need to make sure we understand and think about any possible ways, any possible preparations that we might need to make, not only for a worst-case contingency, but also to make sure that we retain our ability to shape the strategic situation and preserve American influence and ability to help our allies and our friends in the region. This is just a brief overview of some of the issues I'm going to talk about today, and of course I'm going to center it around the undersea warfare aspect here. Now, I'm sure I don't need to tell you why China's important. Just look at this quote from the National Intelligence Council here. Clearly, China is already important and will be more so in the future. Now, in terms of general points, I'm going to give you my larger takes, the big takeaways right up front here. If you get nothing else out of this lecture, I hope that you'll consider these following points, which I'm happy to explain more in the Q&A, but in the interest of time, I can't go into great detail here. Bottom lines. Number one, although it's uneven, China is achieving rapid development of capabilities both in the maritime and the aerospace realms. And those capabilities are divided among China's different service arms, and there may be competition between those service arms as new capabilities emerge, new forces emerge, perhaps in the area of space capabilities in the future. China's carefully acquired technologies which target limitations in the physics of high technology warfare. And this threatens to place some potential high-end competitors, such as the U.S. Navy, on the costly end of an asymmetric arms race if we don't make the right decisions about the sorts of platforms and approaches that we take in the future to deal with this. Now, in addition to widespread incremental improvements, I would argue, China's on the verge of achieving what I would call several potentially game-changing breakthroughs. Particularly, this would refer to potential development of anti-ship ballistic missiles, but also streaming cruise missile attacks, anti-satellite capabilities, potentially facilitated in the case of the missiles with the application of satellite navigation. Now, these achievements collectively on China's part promise to radically improve China's so-called access denial capabilities by allowing it to hold at risk a wide variety of surface and air-based assets were they to enter strategically vital zones on China's contested maritime periphery in the unfortunate event of conflict. Now, at the same time, China faces ongoing challenges in its military development, and we shouldn't minimize that. In terms of realism of training, human capital, and a variety of other areas, the People's Liberation Army is still struggling to catch up and become a world-class military. However, I would say that China has many ways to mitigate these limitations for kinetic operations around Taiwan and other areas of its contested maritime periphery. Potentially also for non-kinetic peacetime operations further afield. We see the very positive Chinese deployment to the Gulf of Aden to support counter-piracy efforts there. However, I would argue, we can debate this and discuss this in the Q&A, that conducting high-intensity wartime operations in contested environments beyond Taiwan would necessitate major qualitative and quantitative improvements in PLA capabilities and corresponding costs and vulnerabilities that China would have to deal with. Now, in terms of what this all means for the U.S. Navy, I think the biggest question is whether or not China will eventually seek to make the investments and the policy decisions necessary to make that move from a focus on capabilities around the first island chain and closer in to going much further out. And I think the jury's still out on that one. I'm going to skip through a number of these slides. With an educated audience like this, who's very familiar with U.S. interests in military policy, I think I don't have to say why Chinese capabilities on its immediate maritime littoral could be significant and of interest to the United States. I'm also not going to go deeply into debates concerning the so-called revolution in military affairs. I know there are a lot of definitions of that and a lot of different ideas on what it actually means. What I'm just trying to say here, and drawing on two articles that I found particularly helpful, and Krepenevich has just written a great piece in Foreign Affairs that follows up on this theme here. In my mind, it's a false argument, it's a false dichotomy, so to speak, to put all the U.S. military assets on the table and all the Chinese military assets on the table, and then conclude that because China's assets in aggregate in many ways are much less than those of the U.S., that there could never be a concern for the U.S. in terms of China's military capabilities. You've got to match them up to specific scenarios, specifically the most likely or the least unlikely scenarios to occur. When you couple that with China's asymmetric approach targeting key technologies that potentially put U.S. platforms on the wrong end of physics, this is where China does not have to become a so-called near-peer competitor or peer competitor to have capabilities that potentially challenge interests that the U.S. has. So that's what this is all saying here. I'm going to skip this slide. And building on what I just said, in many ways, China has not achieved some of these key game changers, perhaps. It may not have all the capabilities fully in place, whether it's the ISR support or the confidence in being able to use some of these weapons, or even having some of the weapons for sure, in the case of the anti-ship ballistic missile. But so much has happened in the past decade that China appears, in my view, to be on the verge of achieving some pretty dramatic improvements in hardware, and even to having the software and the human capabilities to operate that properly, although those capabilities are harder to develop and probably are lagging some of the hardware capabilities. So again, what's this asymmetric focus? I mean, people can debate what even the term asymmetric means, and I had one respected China analyst tell me, well, any military effort is asymmetric because of course you're always targeting the weaknesses. I don't want to get wrapped around the axle in semantics debates here. My point is, China appears to be very carefully and very intelligently deciding to put concentrating its resources in areas that give the most bang for the buck in terms of targeting the areas where, based on physics, U.S. and allied platforms would tend to be the weakest. So let me give you two examples of this development, submarines and sea mines. Many of you are familiar with the Song-class submarine. It's an indigenous, conventionally powered Chinese submarine. It hasn't been, construction stopped in '04, but 13 successively better ones were built. And to me, what this shows is, while China is not at the U.S. level in submarine production, China can build reasonably capable submarines that keep getting better with time. Now, what's a specific application of this? Well, according to the 2007 DoD report to Congress, the USS Kitty Hawk was approached by a Song-class submarine, which then broached or accidentally surfaced. But the point is, apparently, if the media reports are to be believed, the submarine got pretty close. This suggests that perhaps Chinese submarines are making an effort to monitor certain activities. They know how to potentially get to certain areas that are important. They may not be perfect in how they operate the submarines, but it's a real sea change for where we think they were several years ago. Now, a more advanced class of submarine launched in May 2004, the Yuan class. A lot of Russian influence in this submarine, as we've seen with past Chinese efforts. But the most intriguing thing in my mind is the possibility that it may now, or at some point in the future, have air-independent propulsion. For the non-submariners here, what does that mean? It basically means a lot more power for the submarine. So the commander of the submarine has a choice. It's possible for 2 hours to have the power and the evasion capability of a nuclear-powered submarine, or for perhaps as long as 2 weeks, have the ability to go around at 2 or 3 knots very quietly, both potentially useful combat capabilities. But China's not satisfied with that. At the same time, as in so many other areas, it's been building new capabilities, trying to reverse engineer, but also buying advanced foreign systems, in this case from the Russians with the Kilos. If you look at the latest unclassified Office of Naval Intelligence report on China's Navy that just came out, there are some very interesting charts which basically compare the relative noise level of various Chinese and Russian submarines. What I read from that chart, and I'm not read into any classified material, and I'm not an operator, but what I interpreted as, it was saying the Yuan and the Song are somewhat quiet, and the Kilo is very quiet. Might be very difficult to find in some respects. I raised this picture for you here because you can notice that on the left we have a picture of Song Hull 1, I believe from 1992. And then on the right, we have a picture of the screw from that Kilo class submarine in the previous slide that was sold to China. There's a striking similarity in the back of both of the screws. We can see a cruciform vortex dissipator, potentially a very advanced quieting technology. Now, it seems like the Russians had transferred this to China already by 1992, so soon after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It raises the question in my mind, what else might have been transferred? And I think a lot of other things were. Of course, on the deterrence side, we have the Type 094 Jin class launched. However, the status of the JL2 SLBM to actually make it a useful platform is unclear. Moreover, if you look at the charts in this unclassified O&I report, it seems to show that the Jin class compared to Russian SSBMs is not necessarily that quiet. So we may expect in the future to see further iterations where China tries to improve this. That's just my guess based on the available information. Now, this picture, which I believe showed up in China's Navy newspaper, or People's Navy, Renmin Haijun, is very interesting to me in the sense that, based on, I think, the context of the article it was associated with, what we see here is potentially a loadout for a Song-class submarine. This may even be a typical loadout, although I have no way of backing that up. But if it is, look at the ratio of these 6 C-801 anti-ship cruise missiles to the 2 torpedoes. What we seem to be seeing in terms of a trend, and what the ONI report states very specifically, is that China is prioritizing its conventionally powered submarines and its surface assets for anti-surface platforms, meaning anti-ship cruise missiles. Whereas there's not as much effort apparently made in the area of anti-submarine warfare. How can that be? I'll get to that in a second, but that's one potential takeaway from this picture. Well, in short, I think China's very extensive mine warfare development may be a sort of poor man's anti-submarine warfare, a stopgap measure, among other things, to get a capability in the meantime that China can't get in any other way. We've just spent 5 years looking at over 1,000 Chinese language sources to try to get a grip on what China's doing with mine warfare. And the answer seems to be a lot. Potentially an enormous arsenal. We've seen estimates in Chinese sources ranging from 50,000 to 100,000 sea mines. Of course, many of these in the past were relatively obsolete Soviet copy models, so to speak. However, in keeping with China's overall S&T revolution, we see an enormous amount of research going on into sea mine development at a wide range of civilian and military institutions in China. Part of this is a process of the first quotation here, 智能化, or intelligizing the mines. This means doing a fuse retrofit akin to a sort of adding a JDAM tail kit, or like the U.S. upgrade of the U.S. destructor mines that were laid in Haiphong Harbor in the Vietnam War, potentially preserving the operational relevance of otherwise obsolete mines. Now, also an effort on China's part to look at some more exotic technologies here. In the top right, for example, you can see a diagram from a Chinese naval encyclopedia talking about a sea mine that could actually go out of the water, hit a low-flying MCM helicopter. My understanding is that this is technically possible, but I have no evidence that China has actually pursued this. There are claims that they have, but who knows at what stage they're at. I should also say the rocket-delivered sea mines and the term I use here, nuclear-armed sea mines, these again are discussed in the Chinese sources. There's no concrete evidence I've found that such things have actually been deployed, so I just wanted to be very clear about that. But clearly it's being discussed, all kinds of different things that can be done here. Advanced systems from Russia, such as the PMK-2. This is a very formidable mine, I believe a rocket rising mine that James, I think, says can be laid in waters as deep as 2,000 meters. Also, civilian training in the laying of mines. This might be a more basic type of thing for defensive mine laying around ports, but the point is civilian and militia forces are practicing doing this, and potentially there might be some way to leverage some of those capabilities in the event of conflict. These are just some summaries of roughly 13 terms that in over 1,000 Chinese sources came up again and again and again. So we thought they might have some potential strategic significance. Calling it a CONOPS is making it sound more official than it actually is, so I don't want you to think that we're saying it's official. Let me just unpack 4 of these terms for you. I think the rest are pretty self-explanatory. And no, we didn't forget the quotes on the ones that don't have quotes. Those are the ones where it wasn't a specific Chinese character phrase. It was different ways of saying the same thing that came up again and again. Not attracting attention. A lot of the Chinese sources we look at say, look, sea mines are great. If we build a bunch of carriers right now, you know, people in Japan and the US and other countries would get all concerned. But sea mines, you know, it's not sexy, it's not exciting, hardly anyone pays attention. Certainly not the general public in other countries. Good area to invest in a way that will not harm China's image of peaceful development that it's seeking to get out there. 4 ounces can move 1,000 pounds. This is basically saying something as small as a sea mine can threaten something as large as a large vessel, potentially even a carrier strike group in some of the more ambitious Chinese analyses. Undersea sentry. This is saying, look, this could be a form of ASW that we can't get any other way. Finally, satellite navigation. This is a real force multiplier for China. Before satellite navigation, it's hard to imagine how civilian forces could lay mines effectively without running afoul of their own minefields. Now there's potentially a way to do it. I just threw the 200-meter curve and the 2,000-meter curve, and I should say here that this is group research with my colleagues at CMSI, including Professors Lyle Goldstein and William Murray. So Bill was actually the one who put the meter curves here, but essentially anything less than 200 meters depth, a wide range of sea mines can be used. Up to 2,000 meters, a variety of rocket rising sea mines, some of which we know China now has, can be used, especially if there's an advanced Kevlar cable. Beyond 2,000 meters to the east of Taiwan, this would require potentially drifting mines, which China is reported to have. It's not possible to get a lot of unclassified open source info on that, but various Chinese sources do say they've certainly developed them in the past, and potentially they still have them. Okay, returning to my theme of game changers, I discussed these before. I think we're seeing some really impressive advancements in hardware. In terms of software, that likely lags in terms of some of the concept of operations and the human capabilities. However, that is being ramped up as well, probably very unevenly, but China is, I think, making progress in that area, sufficient that we have to take these capabilities, potential capabilities, seriously. And if and when China does get to a fairly high level with these capabilities, these areas are, I call, game changers, because they could have a disproportionate leverage for China. A lot of you have heard of anti-ship ballistic missile development. It's talked about more and more. Actually, I'll have a new article out on this up on the website of the Naval War College Review on Tuesday, so I'll ask Professor Yu to circulate that to anyone who's interested. The reason why this is so significant is we rely significantly on carrier strike groups. If there's a way to target them in this new way, we'll have to think very creatively about ways in which we might be able to counter that. But clearly China's looking to achieve a deterrent here and not have a repeat of the 1995-1996 U.S. intervention in the Taiwan conflict. Let me also call your attention to these range rings from the DoD report, including what they call the CSS-5 or DF-21 ASBM. Look at the potential range on this. It's not just the first island chain in Taiwan. Potentially, if they can make it work, it could hold at risk platforms far beyond that, creating some strategic depth at sea that China, I think, would want to have. Now, just very basically, I know I've got about 5 minutes before I'm supposed to wrap up here. I want to propose to you a way of thinking about China's military capabilities development, especially in the maritime dimension, that is almost a bifurcated two-part aspect. Obviously, this is simplified. And reasonable people can debate it, and let's debate it. But what my basic argument here is that up to Taiwan and a little bit beyond, China's had a huge ramp up in capabilities, focus on anti-access, puts them on the interior lines and the right side of physics. A lot they can do with this, and they've got a lot of strategic priorities there. This is potentially difficult for the U.S. and its friends and allies to deal with, and we need to be very creative in thinking about that. Beyond Taiwan, in my view, it gets a lot more difficult. China is no longer necessarily on the right side of physics. It would have to do a lot to really develop robust combat-ready capabilities in these areas. And there would be so many steps that we would see them doing. They would have to spend years getting very good at carrier operations. They'd have to build a lot of oilers and auxiliaries that they could probably build right now without a problem, but we're not seeing them build in large numbers. They'd have to do a lot of deployments to really get good at blue water training and operations, and so far what we've seen, although it's growing, is relatively modest. So I think this issue will be playing out over the next few years and over the key years of many of your careers. So I think it merits careful studying, but I would caution against, I would respectfully disagree with those who, in my view, conflate the rapid progress up to Taiwan and a little beyond with the more modest and complex and low-intensity progress far beyond that. And again, as China moves in this direction, which I think it will at a very modest pace, it's going to create a lot of vulnerabilities for itself. Some of the same types of vulnerabilities it can tap into with respect to U.S. platforms right now, it will itself become vulnerable to if and as it moves more in this direction. And among other things, there will be major organizational challenges for China. I would say that in the organizational area, that's one of the areas that China is most challenged. It has a system that is very good at managing certain types of things, but crisis management, rapid military decision making, I think is one of the more difficult areas for them. And it's also a very sensitive area for them to work on because it's very closely tied to an unusual party-state system, a rather centralized system, although we've seen counterexamples of delegation down, arguably in operations in the Sino-Indian War and other contexts. But when it comes to high-level weapons and worst-case scenario conflict with major powers, I think this centralization is still very alive and well in Chinese military strategic thinking. So can they move beyond that to deal with real-time contingencies? That would certainly be a potential challenge. However, I come back to my point earlier that China does not need to be a near peer or a peer competitor to produce significant strategic challenges to significant interests of the U.S. and key allies and friends along the East Asian littoral. So focusing on that as a subject, China already has a significant strategic weight that it can throw around, and it's determined to pursue these interests. And frankly speaking, I think that is natural from a standpoint of being a great power. Maybe I'm a bit of a realist, and we can debate that too, but I am not arguing that what China is doing is peculiar or unusual or only a product of its current government system. I think if China has a different government system in the future, things might be even more nationalistic and destabilizing because a lot of these nationalistic views of what constitutes China's territory and how to defend it and how to reclaim it and secure it is really deeply rooted in Chinese society. That's been my experience, at least. So I'll leave in a good academic fashion. I will leave you with some questions that I was unable to fully answer myself, but on a more serious note and returning to the theme of where is China going to go with all this? Beyond Taiwan, beyond the first island chain, what's next? As China gets more confident with those issues, what's the next step here? And again, I think for many years in our careers, this is what we're going to be studying among other things. And as I said before, China's made a lot of progress rapidly, particularly with the low-hanging fruit of asymmetric approaches, especially drawing on various types of missiles. But China faces challenges, especially if it tries to do more symmetric and ambitious things further afield. So studying the specific aspects of those things are a way that we can get key insights into where China may be headed and what challenges it may face along the way. So I'll now open the floor to questions, defer back to Professor Yu for how he wants to run this event, and thank you all very much.
a requirement except that maybe Mr. Erickson would repeat the question so that the question will be captured on the video.
Absolutely.
You can.
Please.
Thanks for your great assessment. I was wondering what you recommend perhaps for new priorities for the U.S. Kind of more strategic force development in light of this assessment, whether it's platforms or doctrines, kind of going forward as China continues to improve, as you call it, this asymmetric capability.
Absolutely. That's an excellent question, and I think it's a question that people who know these... Oh, yes. So essentially, what do I recommend that the U.S. should do in terms of weapons acquisition platforms and strategies to deal with some of these asymmetric approaches that China is taking? I think I've captured your question. First of all, I'm not an operator, I'm not a policymaker, so I want to be very cautious in what I advocate. I think the best thing for me to do is put this in terms of what types of questions ought to be asked. I think the fundamental question, and I should also preface this by saying, as I said at the beginning, there's a lot that the U.S. and China can do together. Right in the Gulf of Aden, that's great cooperation. I don't want that whole aspect of this to be drowned out by the fact that I'm focusing on the areas where we have some challenges between ourselves. But to go to the challenges, I think the biggest question we need to ask when considering a strategy, a weapons system, a platform procurement, or how they all fit together is, does this put us on the right side of physics, or does this put us on the wrong side of physics? And within the putting us on the right side of physics, does it do so in a way that is not overly escalatory?
I was wondering also if you could kind of elaborate that term.
Sure, absolutely.
Maybe an example.
So, well, it's always hard to think of what would be the best example, because then you're giving an example of a weapon system that someone dearly loves, and I understand that. But I think most basically we see China putting a lot of effort into various types of missile development. So a natural response in many people's view is China builds missiles. Well, we need to build missile defense. Now, I certainly think that the U.S. needs to pursue some missile defense, and I would further argue that the Navy's programs, I'm sounding parochial here, but frankly, it's hard to find a more successful program than the SM-3. That appears to be working very well. However, we need to ask ourselves in the fullness of time, are various types of missile defense systems going to be adequate to deal with some of the missile capabilities that China could produce? And I've gone on record several years ago saying at the national missile defense level, I think China can outbuild and out-decoy and out-deal with what we could potentially do with national missile defense. I think it's good for rogue states like North Korea that have less capabilities, but in the future we're facing, where there's going to be limited money, increasing challenges, increasing Chinese capabilities, and increasing things around the world we're going to have to deal with, we're going to have to ask hard questions about how much money do we want to spend on types of missile defense that would be, some people would say, would be targeted at China. And I know that's a real hot potato, but I'm just saying we can't look at any system in isolation. We have to look at, are there systems that would be more effective on the right side of physics? By that I mean that that it's very expensive and difficult to counter these systems, as opposed to you can do it with a lot of missiles that are a lot less expensive than the system. And there are passive ways to do this as opposed to active ways as well. For example, putting more things underwater and in the air. That makes things a lot more difficult. Submarines and SSGN, that's really on the right side of physics. That's an example. Underwater, very hard to access, very hard to defeat. These are just some preliminary thoughts on that, but I think we also need to do more with mine warfare. It's not enough people talk about it, but it's a rounding error compared to what we spend on some other systems. China itself has, in Chinese strategic writings, talk with great concern about Chinese vulnerability to mines. This would be a way of having the capability, in the worst case scenario, we hope never happens, to provide a way to check Chinese forces without contemplating extremely dangerous, escalatory, and risky to civilian strikes on mainland China, which we would hope would never have to be done. These are some of the types of investments and approaches that could be considered. This all needs to be just debated and discussed and planned by people who know these platforms a lot better than I do. But in terms of an approach, I think this is at least worth considering. I don't think we can necessarily follow the same old approach of we're going to do everything, we're going to be the best at everything, we're going to be overwhelming at everything. I think China is getting to the level of overall technological and national competency where they have some real capabilities too. We have to be smarter in our approach, and of course that includes trying not to have a war in the first place, which I think we can avoid. But I think there's not going to be a war. I think instead there's going to be a prolonged period of what I'd almost call strategic shadow boxing, whereas two great powers, the US and China, cooperate. We have a lot of shared interests. But at the same time, we each have our strategic interests. We develop weapon systems and we maneuver to try to deter each other and promote those interests. And that's where the real, I think, competition and action is going to be. And that's where we have to acknowledge that China has its own interests, but at the same time, the US and its allies and friends have their interests. And I'm advocating these efforts because we have to be able to stand up for those interests, defend those interests, and have the sort of leverage to make sure that our interests are not eroded there.
Dr. Erickson, let me tease out a little bit in the way of implications, possible long-term ramifications of that last remark you just made. By focusing on the effectiveness of their aerial denial capability, you've effectively reframed the Navy's strategic mission from sea control and power projection to learning more capably to cope with a potential peer competitor of comparable regional capability, at least, in terms of area denial. Fighting is a bad idea, granted, and given what you just conceded, the historical record, I would submit, is not a very bright one for powers in the past several hundred years managing the rise of even regional peer competitors. Traditionally, great powers suck at doing this. And I have little reason, given our strategic leadership since 1986 and conceivably since World War II, that we're likely to do a better job of it than the British did with the Germans, and a whole host of examples over time to submit. What will that amelioration, in your estimation, be based on? I mean, that's a grand strategic and discretionary political question, but you know China very well. How will the U.S. effectively manage that Chinese rise to regional status? What will be required for the United States to bring China into the role of a responsible strategic power in the region that is consistent with our interests instead of the basis for a really nasty conflict?
So the question was, if I may, how can the U.S. manage the rise of China into a regional great power, if you will, particularly given the historical track record, which shows many very unfortunate examples of conflict resulting when a new power rises and an existing power has to deal with that. That's an excellent question. I think grappling with that is going to be one of the fundamental questions of our time. Managing China's rise appropriately, consistent with our interests, but also acknowledging that they do have their own national interests, is going to be a real challenge. We have, as a superpower, we have a tremendous amount of power and national interests. And as a rising great power, China has very significant ones as well. And then you project that into the East Asian theater, and there are some real challenges. There are things on which we really don't fully agree. That is a tough one to answer. I guess I I would say, first of all, and I don't presume to change the Navy's way of doing things. I'm just trying to raise some issues to think about. I would go out on a limb and argue that if we want to plan ahead and get real about this, we have to at least allow for the possibility that China will develop the capabilities that I'm describing that in aggregate make it such that the U.S. does not have unlimited options in the East Asia region. I'm trying to argue that we need to think creatively so that we can do as well as we can in that respect in terms of preserving formidable capabilities and deterrence, so that we can defend our national interests, support our allies, support our friends in the region. But I think that China's power accretion and strategic focus is formidable enough that we're going to have to accept this is a real change. This is a real new era. Now, part of managing this is going to be working with the Chinese on the things that we do have in common. And I think there is a lot of shared interests that we do have in common, particularly outside the immediate region when it comes to military issues. So, for example, I'm heartened to see the deployment to the Gulf of Aden. I think we should continue to say what I think we're saying, which is this is a great opportunity for China to increase its status by being a stakeholder. And I think the Chinese finally understand what we mean by that term, meaning essentially, well, to paraphrase, I know this quote has been traced to Spider-Man among other sources, but with great power comes great responsibility. You want to be a great power, that's understandable. You also need to make increasing contributions to the international system and across the board. So China needs to keep providing more of those public goods to international security. They're starting to do so with piracy. They're doing a lot with UN peacekeeping operations. And we need to make it clear to the Chinese that we appreciate those contributions, and those are good. I think we should save our displeasure and our deterrence for the areas that are really strategically harmful to us. I think we have to be more careful about how we prioritize the things we really can't live with China. One of my personal views, to raise another explosive issue here, is one of the issues we should be telling the Chinese is deeply destabilizing and worrisome is the potential Chinese development of an anti-ship ballistic missile based on the DF-21 Delta, according to some sources. So cooperate in a large number of areas, and then at the same time work really hard and be creative about preserving the capabilities in the military areas that really matter, and making it clear to China that we will defend our interests there, we will maintain our capabilities there. It's not an easy question to answer. Those are some initial thoughts. I don't know if you had a follow-up to that.
No, I think it sounds very sensible.
Other questions? Yes, please.
Just recently, the United States officials, along with Australian officials and Chinese officials, have talked about increasing the military cooperation between these three nations. And in addition to the advantages in cooperating more with the Chinese, do we seek to gain learning more about their naval capabilities, and what risks do we have about them learning more about our naval capabilities that they could potentially exploit with new weapons?
That's a great question. So military to military cooperation, what's the incentive structure here? To the extent that it increases, how much does that benefit China versus benefit the U.S.? And should the U.S. be concerned about having more cooperation because China might learn more about our platforms and weapon systems? Well, excuse me for being a little bit flippant here, but I spend a lot of my time reading Chinese language sources. pretty much how I follow the U.S. Navy is by reading Chinese language sources. Every little detail. You even have little discussions of the different mascots and the different logos on things. I mean, I'm sure there's some detail that's not covered, but whatever it is, I haven't found it yet. My point here is, even just at the open source unclassified level, China is hoovering up every bit of data, and we are an open society. That is one of our strengths, but it also means that China can learn so much about what we're doing just by looking on websites, by talking with the people, by reading Aviation Week and space technology, things like that. So I would argue that China already knows quite a bit. Now the challenge is, in my view, we don't know nearly as much about China. It's a much more opaque system. There's been some modest progress recently with more white papers and more disclosure, but they still don't report a lot of basic data to the UN. They still don't talk about a lot of things that almost all other militaries of that caliber or that size talk about, certainly in the Western world. So in my view, we have to be judicious and we have to be cautious, but these military-to-military exchanges, when run properly, are a chance to learn a lot more, get a much better sense about how China's developing its military and what are its intentions. Because what I suspect happens a lot of the time is, and I haven't been in their shoes, but our decision makers have a lot of data about some specific capabilities. But at the end of the day, what they really want to know is, how does this all come together? Where does the human capital part of this puzzle come? And under what contingencies would China really do what? I think those intangibles we don't have a good read on. Those are the sorts of things that you can learn invaluable things about if you just talk to people. I mean, I've interacted with the PLA. I've gone to a lot of conferences in China, and I've talked with a lot of interlocutors. Does it teach me everything that I would like to know? No, but it gets me a lot further. And it's also amazing, I think, in the right context, how much some interlocutors are willing to talk. Is it a panacea? No. Do we have to be careful? Yes. But my view is we should continue gradually trying to open this up a bit more. And it's also it's a valuable forum for strategic communications. There are messages we need to be sending to the Chinese, and there are messages the Chinese need to be sending to us. And that includes deterrent messages. This is an important way to communicate to their military and their top decision makers what are those core things that we're truly concerned about, as opposed to the other things that in an ideal world we might not want to live with, but we may well have to live with. What are the real things that we really want to tell them? If you do that, there will be consequences. If you do that, I hope you realize what balancing effects there'll be. For all these reasons, we have to be careful, but I hope we gradually and judiciously increase and broaden this sort of thing in the future. One last thought on that. I think there are a lot of cases where China says that it's willing to show us more, but then the opportunity never comes up, so they don't have to show us more. Why not give them that opportunity to make good on their offers? See what happens. I think there's a way to do it that's within our national interest. Next question. I haven't seen any questions from this side of the room. I don't know if it's the center group.
Do you think there's going to be any big military display coming up on their 60th anniversary this coming year?
Will there be a big military display on the 60th anniversary of the people's the PRC, namely October 1st? I think is you're referring to. I think the answer is yes. There's been rampant speculation of what exactly is going to be shown, and maybe Professor Yu has studied this as well. I don't know. There have been news media rumors that new types of missiles will be displayed. What that actually means is unclear. How the whole cross-strait relations picture fits into this is unclear. There were also some rumors that Beijing would limit some of the missile displays to make people in Taiwan feel less uncomfortable about it. I have no hard data on any of that. What I do know is I'm sure there will be some things that we've not seen released officially before, but we shouldn't get our hopes way up and then get totally disappointed. I'm thinking back to the Qingdao Fleet Review, which was very interesting earlier this year. It was China's first international fleet review, a huge sign of newfound confidence on the part of the PLA Navy. Very useful to have those things on display. But a big deal was made by China's official media, I believe, about having new types of submarines and nuclear submarines. Well, they showed what, in a relative sense, were old submarines. Their four most advanced classes of submarines were not on display there. So, yes, there's probably a lot to be seen there, and it'll be fascinating. And if you're like me and you just are fascinated with every little data point that comes out of China's military, it'll be a great thing to watch. But don't expect suddenly the doors to open and they'll explain what exactly they're doing with the anti-ship ballistic missile and we'll get all the data. That's probably asking for too much at this point. Please.
Not a question, but a statement. I've had the opportunity to work in China. I've had a project team in China for almost a year in another life working on a technology project funded by the State Department, our State Department. It was harder for me to get the technology out of China than it was to do the project for almost a year. It's tough. It is very, very, you bring technology in there, it is tough to get it out. And we spent months to get everything back out.
Can you elaborate on that? What are the implications?
Well, they wanted to keep everything. And we gave them intellectual capital. They wanted hard technology. The hard technology is what we brought to do this project for them, funded by the State Department. And it was just very, very difficult to work there under those conditions because you always had to be very careful of what you left, what you took, who you dealt with. Then we hosted them back in the United States. That in itself was another eye-opening experience. Because in a delegation, you have two different kind of people. The intellectual capital, the intellectual person, and the communist head. And you had to figure out who's who. Because they'll tell you who the intellectual person is in charge of the delegation, but you have to figure out who the communist is. That was a real treat.
That's very insightful. Thank you for sharing that with us.
It was an eye-opening experience that I'll never forget.
Thank you, sir. Any other questions? I don't know how we're doing on time here.
We have time for two questions.
Please, I saw you first.
Sure. The discussion is largely focused on kind of the bipolar strategic relationship between the U.S. and China. It seems to me that there are two other regional powers, if you will, in India and Japan that have strong strategic interests as well, arguably stronger than ours in that region. How are they lined up with China strategically? Is it purely China preparing their military for us, or are there more regional considerations as well between China, India, and China, Japan?
Well, I certainly don't want to speak for a strong U.S. ally and a good U.S. friend. These issues are very complex and very sensitive, and China has territorial disputes with both of those nations, which makes it very sensitive, very difficult, and I think is of concern to the Indian military and the Japan self-defense forces. I think it's interesting to note that whereas in the past China had a huge number of border disputes, territorial disputes, it's settled them, to my understanding, it has settled every land border dispute. I think China has, 14 neighbors roughly, land neighbors. Every land dispute except with India, where there are major ones left, and potentially with Bhutan, although it's very hard to get any data on that, so that's I think that's much less of a sensitive flashpoint. It's the maritime disputes that China has not chosen to settle, except in a very specific case with the Beibu Gulf with Vietnam. In some cases, these disputes are not even clearly defined. For example, in the South China Sea, on all the Chinese maps, we can see the dashed line, but there is no consensus in China, as far as I can tell, as to what that line actually means. There are at least three major explanations. So I think what this all adds up to is there are ongoing territorial issues that are very sensitive and automatically bring in a component of military concern that add to the challenges in the relations between China and those nations. How that will be addressed over time and how that will be addressed in the future, I don't know, and I cannot speak for. But I think definitely there are concerns in both of those nations about that. That's the impression that I have. Thank you.
Do you foresee any proliferation of Chinese technology? Maybe not the advanced stuff, but maybe a generation ago, stuff that's still relatively new compared to some of its neighbors. Any proliferation of the technology, and if so, what are the implications for our policy?
Well, I think we already we have seen considerable proliferation of technology over the years. Pakistan being the primary recipient of missiles, that's for sure. Potentially some assistance with their nuclear weapons program, although that's a lot harder to document, I think, given the secrecy. All kinds of fighter aircraft. What you see more and more is other nations expressing an interest. It used to be that a certain number of third world nations, particularly those ones that did not have good relations with the West and did not have money to buy the most expensive systems and did not have diplomatic standing to be able to buy from a lot of countries, those were sort of a core small niche market. I think in the future, as China's weapons become a lot more desirable, there'll be demand much more broadly for them. And I think we will see potentially more proliferation, including of cruise missiles and types of systems that might give us concern. I would bring up Iran in this category, which has received quite a bit of military hardware from China, as far as I understand. So on one hand, this is something to keep track of and is a basis for significant concern. On the other hand, in keeping with what I was saying before, we also have to recognize this as an area of potential Chinese leverage. I think gone are the days, if they ever existed, where the U.S. could say, China, we don't like you to do that, don't do that, and then China wouldn't do that. China is going to pursue its own interests in the international system, and I think will even, at least subtly, try to leverage some of these issues. They continue to be very upset about the arms sales, our arms sales to Taiwan. At least informally, speaking with some Chinese interlocutors, I've heard them say, look, until you stop those arms sales to Taiwan, you have no grounds telling us who we can and cannot sell weapons to. So I think it's going to be an issue that will continue to be relevant in the future and be much more in demand in the future. So you've hit on a good issue, and another thing that I think we should all keep in mind. Thank you very much. I think Professor Yu is going to close everything now.
Well, thank you very much. That was truly that has been truly in-depth and thoughtful and very informative. And not only because the content is excellent, I would say also it's relevant to our education here. That is the manner in which Dr. Erickson presented this. I highly encourage you to read any of the writings he's done, because it's based on solid research on Chinese language. And for those of you who aspire to be a China-related career in the future, in the Navy and beyond, and you have the absolute good opportunity here. We have a Chinese program here, poli-sci and history and econ. We'll have very, very good programs here. And the Asia Forum is the marketplace of ideas that we try to bring those experience in the classroom as well as the experience with outside experts together to share this. So thank you for coming, and stay tuned. We have the next one coming.
If I could just very quickly add, if anyone's interested in further research by the China Maritime Studies Institute, you can go to www.andrewerickson, that's ERICKSON.com. I have my research there, but then under the quick links, you can find a link to the China Maritime Studies Institute, the larger research organization I'm part of, and we have a whole set of a whole set of research products that you can easily download from there.
I think we're going to have a friendly link on the Azure Forum website, so you can all go there through there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very
again.
much.
All right.